I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to gather here with you. Tonight, warm greetings to Pennsylvania, and tell us where you're listening from in the comments, and which piece of jewellery is your favourite. Please subscribe if you enjoy these cosy evenings. Now, let the story unfold. Chapter 1. Tea served with unnecessary care. St Mary Mead, that small and comfortable village which rested so peacefully in its corner of England, had settled into early summer with the quiet satisfaction of a cat finding precisely the right patch of sunlight. The gardens had achieved their full glory without becoming overgrown, the roses bloomed with appropriate modesty, and the weather had been kind enough to allow afternoon calls to be paid without the bother of umbrellas or the discomfort of excessive warmth. It was, as Miss Jane Marple observed while adjusting her hat in the hallway mirror of her small cottage, exactly the sort of afternoon when nothing of consequence was likely to occur. This thought brought a slight smile to her lips, for she had lived long enough to know that the most ordinary days often held the most revealing moments, provided one paid proper attention. She'd received an invitation to take tea at Gossington Hall, the large and rather handsome house that had been the residence of Lady Bantry, for more years than most villagers cared to count. The invitation had been informal, as such invitations often were among those who had known each other for decades, mentioning simply that a few familiar faces would be gathering, and that Lady Bantry would be delighted if Miss Marple could spare the time. The walk to Gossington Hall took Miss Marple along the High Street, past the vicarage where Mrs. Price Ridley was directing her gardener with the sort of enthusiasm that suggested the poor man would have preferred to work alone, and past the row of shops where Mr. Edmonds the grocer was arranging tins in his window with mathematical precision. Miss Marple observed these small tableaux with the gentle interest of one who understood that village life was composed entirely of such moments, strung together like beads on an invisible thread. Gossington Hall appeared through the trees as she turned into the drive, its grey stone facade weathered to a pleasing softness by time and English rain. The garden surrounding it showed the hand of someone who cared deeply but not obsessively, allowing nature a certain freedom while maintaining order where it mattered. Lady Bantry, Miss Marple knew, had always possessed that particular talent for balance. The door was answered by Maitland, the butler who had served the Bantry household for 30 years, and who had acquired the sort of dignified demeanour that came only from long practice and genuine respect for one's position. He greeted Miss Marple with exactly the right degree of warmth, neither familiar nor distant, and showed her through to the drawing-room where the gathering was already in progress. The room was bright with afternoon sun, filtered through curtains that had been drawn back just sufficiently to illuminate without glaring. Lady Bantry herself rose from her chair near the fireplace, a woman of perhaps 60 with the sort of energetic bearing that suggested she had never quite reconciled herself to the idea of growing old gracefully, and had decided instead to grow old vigorously. "Jane, my dear," she said, extending both hands in welcome, "how lovely you could come. I was just saying to Mrs. Carmichael that it's pleasant to gather without any particular reason, don't you think? So much nicer than those dreadful charity events where one must pretend to admire things one would never dream of purchasing." Miss Marple returned the greeting with genuine warmth, for she had always appreciated Lady Bantry's forthright manner and her complete lack of pretension despite her position. It was, she reflected, one of the more admirable qualities in the English character when it appeared, this ability to wear rank lightly. The other guests were arranged about the room with the unconscious artistry that characterises all successful social gatherings. Mrs. Carmichael, the doctor's widow, occupied the sofa with the sort of proprietary comfort that came from being invited everywhere and expected nowhere in particular. She was a thin woman of uncertain age, dressed always in shades of grey and lavender, who possessed the valuable talent of listening attentively while rarely offering opinions of her own. Near the window sat Mrs. Prothero, the banker's wife, a handsome woman in her early 50s whose jewellery was always slightly more prominent than the occasion required. She had been examining a small porcelain figure on the side table, with the concentrated interest of someone who wished to be noticed examining it, and she looked up as Miss Marple entered with a smile that reached her eyes a fraction of a second after it reached her lips. "Miss Marple, how delightful," she said, her voice carrying the cultivated warmth of someone who had learned social graces rather than inherited them. Lady Bantry was just showing us her charming collection of Meissen, such exquisite pieces. The fourth guest was someone Miss Marple had not expected to see. Miss Angela Merrick was a young woman of perhaps 28, cousin to Lady Bantry on the maternal side, who had arrived in St Mary Mead some 3 weeks earlier for what had been described as a brief visit to recover from a bout of influenza. She had a pale, rather serious face with fine features that might have been called beautiful had there been more animation in them, and she dressed with a simplicity that was either the result of excellent taste or limited means. Miss Marple, who noticed such things, suspected it might be the latter. "Angela, dear, do come and sit by Miss Marple," Lady Bantry commanded with cheerful authority. "She won't bite, I assure you, despite what the younger generation might believe about elderly village ladies." Miss Merrick rose with a shy smile and moved to take the chair beside Miss Marple's, and as she did so, Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in her hands, and the way her eyes remained carefully neutral, as though she'd trained herself not to reveal too much through expression. Tea was brought in by Lucy, the parlour maid, a girl of perhaps 19 who had joined the household only 2 months previously. She was neat and capable, with a sort of fresh country complexion that suggested healthy outdoor living, and she arranged the tea things with the careful attention of someone still learning the exact placement of each item. Miss Marple noted that her hands were steady and her movements efficient, and that she kept her eyes properly lowered except for one brief glance toward Miss Merrick that held something Miss Marple could not quite identify. Lady Bantry presided over the tea with practised ease, inquiring after everyone's preferences with the sort of detailed memory that made guests feel valued. The conversation flowed along comfortable channels. The recent church fete, the new curate's rather unfortunate tendency to speak too long, the possibility that Mrs. Henderson's daughter might finally announce her engagement to the young man from the manor house in the next village. It was all perfectly ordinary, perfectly pleasant, and yet Miss Marple found herself paying particular attention to the small currents beneath the surface. She noticed how Mrs. Prothero accepted her tea with both hands, as though the cup were somehow precious or fragile. She observed that Miss Merrick took neither milk nor sugar, but held her cup for several moments before drinking, as though gathering courage for even this simple act. She saw that Mrs. Carmichael watched Lady Bantry with an expression of mild concern that seemed disproportionate to the cheerful nature of the gathering. And she noticed, because Miss Marple noticed everything, that when Lady Bantry rose to fetch something from the writing desk across the room, there was the briefest moment of tension, as though everyone present had simultaneously remembered something they would have preferred to forget. "I wanted to show you all my emerald necklace," Lady Bantry announced, returning with a velvet case in her hands. "I've been thinking I might wear it to the Latimers' dinner next month. It's been sitting in its case for far too long, and jewels ought to be worn, don't you think? Otherwise, what's the point of having them?" She opened the case as she spoke, and the necklace lay against its white satin lining like captured water, the emeralds glowing with that deep green fire that comes only from stones of exceptional quality. It was a beautiful piece, old-fashioned in its setting but timeless in its elegance, the sort of necklace that had been passed down through generations and would continue to be passed down, carrying with it the weight of family history and carefully maintained tradition. "How perfectly lovely," Mrs. Prothero breathed, leaning forward to examine it more closely. "Such extraordinary colour. They must be Colombian, surely." "Indeed they are," Lady Bantry confirmed with evident pleasure. "My husband's grandmother received them as a wedding gift in 1873. I've always thought them rather too grand for St Mary Mead, but then one mustn't let good things languish unused." Miss Merrick had grown very still, her teacup frozen halfway to her lips. Miss Marple, watching her with the careful attention she gave to all things that seemed out of place, saw something flicker across the young woman's face that might have been pain or longing or simple appreciation. "They're beautiful, Cousin Dolly," Miss Merrick said softly. using the family diminutive with evident affection. "You should definitely wear them. They would suit you perfectly." The necklace was admired by all present, passed from hand to hand with appropriate exclamations, and then returned to its case with the satisfied air of something properly appreciated. Lady Bantry placed the case on the side table, remarking that she would have Maitland return it to the safe after tea, and the conversation moved on to other matters. But Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the window with her teacup balanced on her knee, found herself thinking about the way people looked at beautiful things, and about the difference between admiration and desire, between appreciation and need. She thought about Miss Merrick's expression, and about Mrs. Prothero's careful hands, and about the way Lucy the parlour-maid had glanced toward the necklace, with something that might have been fear. It was, she reflected, remarkable how much care people took over tea when they were thinking about something else entirely. How precisely they measured sugar, how thoughtfully they stirred, how unnecessarily attentive they became to matters of cream and cup placement. Tea, she thought with the wisdom of long observation, was often served with the most care when minds were occupied with concerns far removed from refreshment. The afternoon proceeded exactly as such afternoons should, and when Miss Marple took her leave an hour later, walking back through the village in the golden light of early evening, she carried with her the memory of a perfectly ordinary gathering that had contained, she was quite certain, something that was not ordinary at all. Chapter 2. The Empty Velvet Case. The telephone call came to Miss Marple's cottage at 9:30 that evening, just as she was settling into her chair with a book and a small glass of cowslip wine. The telephone, still a relatively recent addition to her household and one she regarded with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion, rang with the particular insistence that suggested something more than a casual inquiry about tomorrow's meeting of the Women's Institute. It was Lady Bantry, and her voice carried a quality Miss Marple had rarely heard in it before. Not quite distress, but something closer to bewilderment, as though the world had presented her with a problem for which her natural optimism had not prepared her. "Jane, my dear, I do apologise for telephoning at this hour," Lady Bantry began, and the apology itself was telling, for Lady Bantry was not usually given to apologising for anything. "But I find myself in rather an awkward position, and I wondered if you might possibly spare a few moments tomorrow morning. That is, if it wouldn't be too much trouble." Miss Marple set down her book with the care of someone who knew she would not be returning to it soon. "Of course, Dolly. Is something the matter?" There was a pause, during which Miss Marple could hear Lady Bantry taking a breath, steadying herself in that way people do when they are about to voice something they have been reluctant to acknowledge even to themselves. "It's the emerald necklace," Lady Bantry said finally. "The one I showed you all this afternoon. I went to put it back in the safe before retiring, and when I opened the case—" Another pause, shorter this time. "It wasn't there, Jane. The case was quite empty." Miss Marple's mind, which had been comfortably occupied with thoughts of fictional murders and the pleasant drowsiness that preceded sleep, became immediately alert in the way a cat's does when something moves in the garden shadows. "I see," she said quietly. "Have you looked elsewhere? Perhaps it was moved during the afternoon." "That's just it," Lady Bantry replied, and now there was a note of something almost like embarrassment in her voice. "I know perfectly well I put it back in the case myself after we'd all admired it. I closed it quite carefully and left it on the side table, intending to have Maitland return it to the safe when he cleared the tea things. But when he came in to do so, he found the case empty and brought it to me at once." "And the case had remained on the side table throughout?" "Yes, precisely there. We all moved through to the conservatory for the last half-hour before everyone departed, as the evening was so pleasant, but the drawing-room was visible through the glass doors the entire time. No one could have entered without being seen." Miss Marple considered this information with the thoroughness it deserved. "And who remained at Gossington after I left?" "Mrs. Carmichael stayed another quarter of an hour, Mrs. Prothero perhaps 10 minutes longer than that, and Angela was with me, of course, until we all went through to the conservatory. The servants were about their usual duties. Lucy cleared the tea things, Maitland attended to the locking up, Mrs. Daniels was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "I shall be happy to call tomorrow morning," Miss Marple said. "Shall we say at 10 o'clock? "You're very kind, Jane. I confess I don't quite know what to do. The necklace is valuable, naturally, but it's not so much that as the whole situation. One doesn't like to think certain things about people one knows." After the call ended, Miss Marple sat for some time in her chair, the book forgotten beside her. She thought about the afternoon, replaying it in her mind with the careful attention she had learned to give to moments that seemed, on the surface, entirely unremarkable. She thought about the way Lady Bantry had opened the velvet case with such casual confidence, the way the emeralds had caught the afternoon light, the way each person present had reacted to the sight of them. Mrs. Prothero's breathing admiration, Mrs. Carmichael's quiet appreciation, Miss Merrick's stillness that had been perhaps a shade too still. And she thought about something else, something that had registered at the time but which she had not consciously noted. The way Lucy, when she had entered to clear the tea things, had glanced not at the necklace itself but at the case, closed by then and resting on the side table, with an expression that might have been anxiety, or might simply have been the concentration of a young servant performing her duties under the watchful eyes of her betters. Miss Marple sighed softly. Disbelief, she reflected, was indeed the villagers' first defence against unpleasant truths. How much easier to believe that something had been mislaid, that memory had played tricks, that there was some perfectly innocent explanation that would reveal itself in the morning light. How much more comfortable than to acknowledge that someone known, someone trusted, someone invited to tea and made welcome, might have taken something that did not belong to them. The following morning arrived with a sort of gentle brightness that made yesterday's sunshine seem almost garish in comparison. Miss Marple dressed with particular care, choosing a pale grey dress and her second-best hat, and set out for Gossington Hall at precisely the hour she had promised. She found Lady Bantry in the morning-room, a smaller and more intimate space than the grand drawing-room, furnished with comfortable chairs and windows that overlook the rose garden. Lady Bantry herself looked as though she had not slept particularly well, though she maintained her customary vigour with an effort that Miss Marple found rather touching. "Thank you for coming, Jane," she said, gesturing Miss Marple to a chair. "I've been turning it over in my mind all night, and I simply cannot make sense of it. The necklace was there, I saw it myself, we all saw it. And then it wasn't. It's like something out of one of those impossible mystery stories, except those always have some clever explanation involving hidden panels or trained animals or whatnot, and I can assure you Gossington Hall has no such facilities." "Perhaps you might tell me exactly what occurred after I left yesterday," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Sometimes the smallest details prove illuminating." Lady Bantry settled herself more firmly in her chair, clearly gathering her thoughts into some semblance of order. "Well, you departed at around 5:30, and Mrs. Carmichael left shortly after. Mrs. Prothero stayed a bit longer, admiring the view from the windows and asking about the herbaceous borders. Angela had gone upstairs to fetch a shawl, as she often feels the cold even in summer. When she returned, we all went through to the conservatory, as I mentioned. And the drawing-room was empty during this time. Not entirely empty. Lucy came in to clear the tea things, which would have been perhaps 10 minutes after you left. Maitland supervised, as he always does with the newer staff. They were in and out for no more than a quarter of an hour, I should think. And the velvet case remained on the side table throughout? Yes, I saw it there myself when we passed through the drawing-room on our way to the conservatory. It was quite closed, exactly as I'd left it. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And when did you discover it was empty?" "Not until after dinner, I'm afraid. I'd intended to return it to the safe immediately, but Angela had a headache and I went up with her to see she had everything she needed, and then there was dinner to oversee, and it wasn't until nearly 9:30 that I remembered. I fetched the case myself and brought it to the library where the safe is, and when I opened it—" She made a small gesture of helplessness. "Nothing, just the empty satin lining." The case showed no signs of having been forced. None whatsoever. The clasp worked perfectly, exactly as it should. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, her fingers pleating the fabric of her dress in a habitual gesture of concentration. "And the safe itself? You're quite certain the necklace wasn't returned there by someone else? I checked, naturally. That was my first thought. But no, it wasn't there. I asked Maitland and Mrs. Daniels if either of them had taken it upon themselves to put it away, but both denied it, and I believed them. They've been with me far too long for such misunderstandings. What of Lucy? Lady Bantry's expression became carefully neutral. I haven't asked her directly. I thought it better to wait. She's very young, Jane, and quite new to the household. I shouldn't like to frighten her with accusations if there's some other explanation. It was, Miss Marple thought, entirely characteristic of Lady Bantry to consider the feelings of a servant before her own distress at losing a valuable family heirloom. It was one of the qualities that made her genuinely liked rather than merely respected, and it was also, Miss Marple recognised, the quality that might make it difficult for her to see certain truths when they presented themselves. Has Angela said anything about the matter? She's terribly upset about it. Quite devastated, really. She feels responsible somehow, though I can't think why. She keeps saying she should have been more vigilant, that she should have noticed something. I've told her it's nonsense, but you know how sensitive she can be. Miss Marple did know, or rather, she was beginning to form an understanding of Miss Angela Merrick based on what she had observed the previous afternoon and what she was hearing now. Sensitivity could manifest in many ways, and not all of them were as straightforward as they appeared. I wonder, Miss Marple said carefully, whether you had mentioned to anyone your plans for the necklace. You said you intended to wear it to the Latimers' dinner next month. Did I? Yes, I suppose I must have. One does mention these things in conversation, doesn't one? I'm sure I've spoken of it to several people. Lady Bantry paused, frowning slightly. Angela knew of it, certainly. We discussed it only last week. She seemed pleased that I intended to wear it again. The conversation continued for some time, covering the various comings and goings of the household, the routine of the servants, the habits of the guests. Miss Marple listened with the patience of someone who understood that truth often emerged not from direct questions, but from the gradual accumulation of small facts, each one insignificant in itself but collectively forming a pattern as clear as a footprint in snow. When she finally took her leave, walking back through the village in the late morning sunshine, her mind was occupied with thoughts of empty cases and closed clasps, of nervous young parlour-maids and pale, sensitive cousins, of emeralds that glowed with green fire and disappeared into air as though they had never existed at all. Disbelief, she thought again, was the villagers' first defence, but disbelief could only hold for so long before it gave way to something else, suspicion, carefully directed toward those who could least afford to bear its weight. Chapter 3. Explanations offered before alarm. News in St. Mary Mead travelled with the peculiar speed that characterised all villages where the inhabitants had known each other for decades and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something was not quite as it should be. By noon, on the day following Miss Marple's visit to Gossington Hall, several people had remarked to several other people that Lady Bantry seemed rather preoccupied, and by tea-time the general consensus was that something had occurred, though what precisely remained a matter for speculation. Miss Marple, encountering Mrs. Price Ridley outside the post office, found herself on the receiving end of a determined inquiry disguised as casual concern. "I do hope Lady Bantry is quite well," Mrs. Price Ridley observed, adjusting her gloves with the sort of emphasis that suggested the gloves were entirely innocent of her true purpose. "I happened to pass Gossington this morning and noticed the curtains in the drawing-room were still drawn at 10 o'clock. Most unusual for Lady Bantry, who was generally so particular about such things." Miss Marple, who had no intention of contributing to village speculation, replied that Lady Bantry had seemed in excellent spirits when last they spoke, which was perfectly true if one did not examine too closely the definition of excellent. "I'm so glad to hear it," Mrs. Price Ridley continued undeterred. "One does worry, you know, particularly with house guests staying. Not that I mean to suggest anything about Miss Merrick, who seems a perfectly pleasant young woman, but house guests can be so tiring, can't they? All that extra effort required." Miss Marple made a non-committal sound and escaped as soon as courtesy permitted, reflecting that Mrs. Price Ridley's talent for discovering things that were none of her concern was matched only by her talent for drawing precisely the wrong conclusions from them. She was therefore not entirely surprised when, returning home by way of the high street, she encountered Lady Bantry herself, emerging from the greengrocer's with a basket over her arm, and an expression of determined cheerfulness that sat somewhat uneasily on features clearly troubled by private concerns. "Jane, how fortuitous," Lady Bantry said, falling into step beside her. "I was hoping I might catch you. Would you care to walk back with me? There have been some developments of a sort." They proceeded together along the familiar route, Lady Bantry maintaining a stream of pleasant observations about the weather and the quality of Mr. Edmund's vegetables, until they were safely beyond earshot of curious windows and interested pedestrians. Only then did her tone shift to something more confidential. "Everyone has been extraordinarily helpful," she said, and there was a note in her voice that suggested this helpfulness had been less comforting than one might imagine. Angela spent the entire morning going through the drawing-room with remarkable thoroughness, checking behind cushions and under furniture. She seems convinced the necklace must have fallen somehow, though how it could have fallen out of a closed case I cannot fathom. "Miss Merrick is naturally distressed by the situation," Miss Marple observed. "Distressed is putting it mildly. She's taken it quite to heart, as though she were personally responsible. This morning at breakfast she barely touched her eggs, and she's usually such a sensible eater." Lady Bantry shifted her basket from one arm to the other. "Mrs. Prothero called round as well, full of suggestions. She thinks I ought to question the servants more closely, particularly Lucy, and she mentioned that her own household lost a silver teaspoon last month, which later turned up in the most innocent of places." Miss Marple made an attentive sound, noting that the comparison between a silver teaspoon and an emerald necklace was sufficiently inexact as to be almost meaningless, though doubtless Mrs. Prothero had intended it as reassurance. "And Mrs. Carmichael sent a note," Lady Bantry continued, "suggesting that I might have placed the necklace elsewhere, while distracted by conversation, and simply forgotten doing so. She mentioned that her late husband once mislaid his reading glasses for 3 days, and found them eventually in the butter dish, though he never could recall putting them there." "Memory can indeed play curious tricks," Miss Marple agreed, "though one generally remembers placing valuable jewellery somewhere, even if one cannot immediately recall where." "Exactly what I thought, but everyone seems eager to find an explanation that doesn't involve—" Lady Bantry paused, choosing her words with care. "The alternative." They had reached the gates of Gossington Hall, and Lady Bantry gestured for Miss Marple to accompany her inside. In the morning room, where yesterday's conversation had taken place, they settled once more into the comfortable chairs, though the comfort was somewhat diminished by the weight of unspoken concerns. "The difficulty," Lady Bantry said, setting down her basket and removing her gloves, "is that every explanation offered has been perfectly reasonable on the surface, but none of them quite addresses what actually happened. Angela insists the clasp might have been loose, and the necklace simply fallen out while the case was being moved, but I examined the clasp myself, and it's perfectly sound. Mrs. Prothero suggests Lucy might have accidentally knocked the case while clearing the tea things and been too frightened to admit it, but Maitland assures me Lucy was nowhere near that particular table." "And what does Lucy herself say?" Lady Bantry's expression became troubled. "That's rather the awkward part. I did speak with her, as gently as I could, and she became quite upset. Not defensive, mind you, but genuinely distressed. She said she remembered seeing the case on the table and being careful not to disturb it, and that she certainly never opened it or touched the necklace. She was so earnest about it, Jane, and her hands were shaking. I felt perfectly dreadful questioning her." Miss Marple considered this information, her mind working through the various possibilities with methodical care. A young servant, newly employed, confronted by her mistress regarding a missing valuable piece of jewellery, would naturally be distressed, whether guilty or innocent. The distress itself proved nothing, though the specific nature of it might prove illuminating if one knew how to read such signs. "Has anyone suggested informing the police?" "Mrs. Prothero mentioned it, but I confess I'm reluctant. It seems such a drastic step, and once one involves the authorities, well, There's no taking it back, is there? The whole matter becomes official and public, and everyone's privacy is invaded, and the servants are questioned like criminals. Lady Bantry shook her head. I keep hoping it will simply turn up. These things sometimes do, don't they? It was, Miss Marple reflected, remarkable how the prospect of scandal could make even the loss of a valuable heirloom seem preferable to the discomfort of public scrutiny. The English upper classes had weathered invasions, civil wars, and the collapse of empires, but the thought of police constables tramping through one's drawing room, questioning one's guests, remained somehow insupportable. Mrs. Carmichael also suggested, Lady Bantry continued, lowering her voice slightly though they were quite alone, that I might have mentioned my intention to wear the necklace to someone who then mentioned it to someone else, and that perhaps word reached, well, someone from outside the village. She thought it possible that a professional thief might have learned of it and taken advantage of the afternoon gathering to slip in unnoticed. That would require remarkable timing and rather detailed knowledge of your household arrangements, Miss Marple observed mildly. Yes, that's what I thought. And besides, Maitland is quite certain no strangers came to the house yesterday. He would have noticed. Lady Bantry rose and moved to the window, looking out over the gardens with an absent gaze. Everyone is being so helpful, offering explanations and theories, and yet somehow all of it feels rather like we're all agreeing not to think about the one possibility that seems most likely. Which is? Lady Bantry turned back from the window, her face showing more vulnerability than Miss Marple had seen in all their years of acquaintance. That someone known to me, someone I invited into my home and offered tea and hospitality, took it. That someone I trust betrayed that trust for the sake of a few emeralds, however valuable. The words hung in the air between them, giving voice to what both had been thinking, but neither had quite stated so plainly. Miss Marple recognised the courage it required for Lady Bantry to speak them aloud, for to acknowledge such a possibility was to acknowledge that one's judgment of character might be flawed, that the comfortable assumptions upon which village life rested might be less stable than they appeared. It's possible, Miss Marple said gently, that the truth is more complicated than simple theft. People act from many motives, not all of them easily understood from the outside. You mean I shouldn't assume the worst of whoever took it? I mean that jumping to conclusions, whether charitable or condemnatory, serves no useful purpose. What we require are facts, carefully observed and honestly considered. Lady Bantry returned to her chair with a sigh. You know, what troubles me most is not even the loss of the necklace itself, though heaven knows it was valuable enough. It's the feeling that follows such a discovery. Suddenly one looks at familiar faces and wonders what lies beneath. One questions every gesture, every word, searching for hidden meanings. It's exhausting and rather horrible. Yet necessary, I'm afraid, if the truth is to be found. Angela suggested this morning that perhaps we should simply accept the loss and say nothing more about it. She said that pursuing the matter would only cause pain and suspicion, and that surely the necklace wasn't worth destroying the peace of the household. Lady Bantry's expression was thoughtful. It was kindly meant, I think, but there was something in the way she said it that troubled me, as though she knew something she wasn't saying. Miss Marple filed this observation away with the others, adding it to the growing collection of small facts and impressions that were beginning to form a pattern, though what that pattern might reveal remained as yet unclear. The conversation continued for some time longer, covering the various theories and explanations that had been offered with such ready helpfulness by concerned friends and neighbours. Each explanation, Miss Marple noted, had the curious quality of being both plausible and incomplete, as though the real explanation lay somewhere in the spaces between what was said and what was carefully left unspoken. When she finally departed, walking back through the village in the warm afternoon light, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the human impulse to explain away uncomfortable truths, to offer reasonable alternatives to conclusions one preferred not to reach. It was, she reflected, a form of kindness, though not always the most helpful kind. People meant well when they suggested lost clasps and faulty memories and professional thieves from distant places. They meant to comfort, to reassure, to to preserve the pleasant fiction that nothing truly wrong could happen among people one knew and trusted. But meaning well, as Miss Marple had learned over many years of careful observation, was not the same as facing reality, and sooner or later reality insisted upon being acknowledged, however many reasonable explanations were piled atop it like layers of comfortable quilts meant to smother something cold and unpleasant beneath. Chapter 4. Politeness that redirected blame. The Women's Institute meeting on Thursday afternoon provided Miss Marple with an unexpected opportunity to observe the subtle currents of village opinion as they shifted and settled in the wake of Lady Bantry's loss. The meeting was held, as always, in the parish hall, where 20 or so women gathered to discuss the upcoming flower show and the perennial question of whether Mrs. Henderson's methods of judging preserves showed appropriate impartiality. Miss Marple arrived punctually and took her usual seat near the back, where she had discovered over the years that one could observe a great deal while appearing to focus primarily on one's knitting. The conversation before the meeting was called to order covered the expected range of topics: gardens, recipes, the new organist's regrettable tendency toward modern hymns, and, inevitably, the matter of Lady Bantry's missing necklace. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had appointed herself the unofficial arbiter of village morality, was holding forth to a small circle of attentive listeners near the tea-urn. Her voice carried rather more than she perhaps intended, or perhaps exactly as much as she intended. One does not like to cast aspersions, she was saying in the tone of someone who very much liked to cast aspersions and did so regularly. But when these things occur, one must consider who had both opportunity and, shall we say, motivation. A young person newly arrived in the household, without established references or family connections in the area, well, it does make one think. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily, though her attention was entirely focused on the conversation unfolding several feet away. "Poor Lucy," Mrs. Carmichael murmured, her gentle voice carrying its own quiet counterpoint to Mrs. Price Ridley's certainty. "She seemed such a capable girl." "Seemed" is the operative word, Mrs. Prothero interjected with the air of someone offering valuable insight. One never truly knows with young people today. They're so much more sophisticated than we were at that age, and sophistication isn't always accompanied by proper principles. The meeting was called to order before this line of discussion could develop further, but Miss Marple had heard enough to understand how opinion was crystallizing. Lucy, the new parlour-maid, was becoming the focus of speculation not through any direct accusation, for that would have been indelicate, but through the careful accumulation of qualified observations, each one perfectly reasonable in itself, but collectively forming a picture of guilt by association with vulnerability. After the meeting concluded, Miss Marple found herself walking part of the way home alongside Mrs. Carmichael, whose own cottage lay in the same direction. Mrs. Carmichael was quiet for the first few minutes, as though gathering thoughts she was uncertain about expressing. "I hope they're not being too hard on that poor girl," she said finally. "Lucy, I mean. Lady Bantry spoke to her, I understand, and the child was quite beside herself with distress." "You don't believe she took the necklace?" Mrs. Carmichael hesitated, her naturally cautious temperament warring with what seemed to be genuine concern. "I don't know what to believe, but I do know that when something goes wrong, people tend to look first at those who have the least ability to defend themselves. It's easier, somehow, than considering alternatives that might be more disturbing." It was, Miss Marple reflected, an astute observation from a woman who usually preferred to avoid such observations altogether. "You're thinking of someone in particular?" "I'm thinking that there were several people in that drawing room, all of whom had equal opportunity." Mrs. Carmichael glanced at Miss Marple and then away, as though regretting having said even this much. "But Lucy is new and young and without family nearby to speak for her. Miss Merrick is Lady Bantry's cousin. Mrs. Prothero is the banker's wife. And I am, well, established. It's much tidier to suspect Lucy." "But you have doubts?" Mrs. Carmichael stopped walking, turning to face Miss Marple with an expression of unusual directness. "I have doubts about many things, Miss Marple. I doubt that a girl who was so careful about her duties, who asked Maitland 3 times whether she was clearing the tea things correctly, would suddenly decide to steal a valuable necklace. I doubt that someone with genuine criminal intent would have been shaking quite so visibly when questioned. And I doubt, she paused, choosing her words with evident care. I doubt that the simplest explanation is always the correct one, however convenient it might be. They parted shortly thereafter, but the conversation remained with Miss Marple as she completed her walk home. Mrs. Carmichael had articulated something Miss Marple herself had been thinking, that the collective movement of village opinion toward Lucy was less an investigation than a retreat toward comfortable assumptions. The following morning brought another development. Miss Marple, working in her garden, was interrupted by the arrival of Lady Bantry, who had walked over without advance notice, always a sign of perturbation in someone who usually observed the proprieties of calling hours. "I've just had the most uncomfortable conversation," Lady Bantry announced without preamble, settling herself on the garden bench with the air of someone who required both seating and sympathetic attention. Mrs. Prothero called round ostensibly to return a book she'd borrowed, but her actual purpose was to inform me, in the most delicate possible terms, that everyone knows Lucy's father was dismissed from his position at the mill in the next county for some sort of financial irregularity. "Everyone knows," Miss Marple repeated, recognising the phrase as one of those convenient fictions villages employed when they wish to present gossip as established fact. Precisely. According to Mrs. Prothero, it's common knowledge, though naturally no one speaks of it directly out of kindness to the girl, the implication being, of course, that dishonesty runs in families and that I was perhaps unwise to employ Lucy without making more thorough inquiries into her background. And is this information accurate? Lady Bantry made a gesture of frustration. "I have no idea. I employed Lucy on the recommendation of the vicar's wife, who knew the family slightly. The girl seemed honest and hard-working, and that was sufficient for me. I didn't think it necessary to investigate her entire family tree for signs of moral weakness." "But now you're being encouraged to reconsider that decision." "Not just encouraged, practically required. Mrs. Prothero was most insistent that I had a duty to the other servants to address the matter firmly. She suggested I might wish to search Lucy's room, which I absolutely refused to do. The very idea is repugnant." Miss Marple set aside her gardening gloves and gave Lady Bantry her full attention. "What does Maitland think?" "Maitland is staunchly defensive of Lucy, which rather surprised me. He says she's been exemplary in her duties and that he would stake his reputation on her honesty. Coming from Maitland, that's no small thing." Lady Bantry paused, her expression troubled. But then Angela said something this morning that gave me pause. She mentioned, quite casually, that perhaps Maitland was simply too kind-hearted to see what was obvious to others, as though kindness was somehow a fault when it came to judging character. Miss Merrick has expressed opinions on the matter. She's been full of opinions, actually. Yesterday she suggested that young servants today aren't raised with the same principles as in previous generations. This morning she mentioned that Lucy had been seen in the village speaking to a young man who works at the garage, implying, well, I'm not entirely sure what she was implying, but the tone suggested something not quite respectable. Miss Marple absorbed this information, adding it to the collection of observations that were beginning to form a clearer picture. "It seems Miss Merrick has taken quite an interest in Lucy's character." "Yes, and it troubles me rather. One expects concern from Mrs. Prothero. She does enjoy a good scandal, though she'd never admit it. But Angela has been so insistent on the matter, so eager to point out Lucy's deficiencies, it feels almost—" Lady Bantry struggled for the word— orchestrated. The conversation meandered through other topics, but Miss Marple's mind remained fixed on this latest development. The redirection of suspicion toward Lucy was proceeding with the smooth efficiency of a well-planned campaign, each piece of damaging information emerging at precisely the moment when it would have maximum effect, each observation phrased with just enough qualification to maintain the appearance of fairness while unmistakably suggesting guilt. It was, she reflected, a masterclass in how politeness could be weaponized, how concern for truth could mask the more urgent concern for protecting oneself, or deflecting scrutiny from more uncomfortable directions. Poor Lucy, with her country complexion and her nervous hands, had become the convenient repository for collective anxiety, the solution that allowed everyone else to remain comfortable in their assumptions about each other. But Miss Marple had observed too many variations of human behaviour to accept convenient solutions simply because they were convenient. She had learned that the most vehement accusations often came from those with the most to hide, and that the person most eager to direct attention elsewhere was frequently the person most deserving of attention. As Lady Bantry departed, still troubled, but somewhat relieved by having voiced her concerns, Miss Marple returned to her gardening with renewed purpose. The weeds, she reflected, were much like unexamined assumptions. Left unattended, they multiplied rapidly and choked out more delicate truths. One had to be vigilant, persistent, and willing to get one's hands dirty to maintain a proper garden. The same principle, she thought, applied equally well to mysteries. Chapter 5, Glances That Did Not Linger. Saturday brought with it one of those minor social obligations that form the backbone of village life, the opening of the church bazaar in aid of the new organ fund. Miss Marple attended as she always did, prepared to admire embroidered cushions she would never purchase and sample cakes she did not particularly want, secure in the knowledge that duty performed was its own reward. The bazaar was held on the vicarage lawn, where trestle tables displayed the fruits of weeks of industrious labour by the ladies of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Price Ridley presided over the white elephant stall with territorial authority, while the vicar's wife moved among the guests with practised grace, ensuring that everyone felt welcome and that no one monopolised her attention for too long. Miss Marple had been examining a rather dubious collection of preserves when she became aware of a small tableau unfolding near the cake stall. Lady Bantry had arrived with Miss Merrick in tow, and they had encountered Mrs. Prothero, who was holding court over an impressive display of sponges and fruit tarts. The three women formed a triangle of polite conversation, their voices carrying the particular brightness that people adopt when discussing inconsequential matters in public, while thinking about something else entirely. What caught Miss Marple's attention, however, was not the conversation itself, but the pattern of glances that accompanied it. Mrs. Prothero, while discussing the merits of various baking techniques with evident enthusiasm, kept her eyes fixed firmly on Lady Bantry's face, never allowing them to drift toward Miss Merrick. It was the sort of careful attention that suggested determined focus rather than natural interest. Miss Merrick, for her part, seemed to have developed a fascination with the contents of her handbag, consulting it with unusual frequency for no apparent reason. Each time Lady Bantry addressed her directly, she looked up with a start as though her thoughts had been miles away, and her answers came a fraction too slowly, preceded by that peculiar pause that indicates distraction rather than consideration. And Lady Bantry herself, normally so forthright in her social interactions, had acquired an air of careful cheerfulness that sat uneasily on her usually genuine demeanour. She praised cakes with perhaps excessive enthusiasm, and purchased items with the slightly desperate generosity of someone attempting to prove through action what words might fail to convey. Miss Marple moved closer, ostensibly to examine a hand-knitted tea cosy, but in reality to position herself where she might observe more clearly. The conversation had moved on to the subject of the upcoming summer fete, but beneath the pleasant exchanges, Miss Marple detected the unmistakable current of tension. "I do think the coconut shy was such a success last year," Mrs. Prothero was saying, "though of course one must be careful about such things with young people about. One never knows quite what might go missing in the general confusion." The remark landed with the weight of deliberate ambiguity. Lady Bantry's smile became, if possible, slightly more fixed. Miss Merrick's hand tightened on her handbag. "I'm sure everyone will be most careful," Lady Bantry replied with careful neutrality. "We've never had trouble with theft at village events." "No, of course not," Mrs. Prothero agreed, though her tone suggested she had just contradicted rather than confirmed. "Those circumstances do change, don't they? New people arrive, standards shift. One must adapt accordingly. It was beautifully done, Miss Marple thought, managing to reference the missing necklace, cast aspersions on Lucy, and imply general moral decline, all while maintaining the appearance of discussing nothing more controversial than coconut shies. Mrs. Prothero had elevated insinuation to an art form. What interested Miss Marple more, however, was what happened next. As the conversation finally concluded and the three women began to disperse, Miss Marple observed Mrs. Prothero's gaze follow Miss Merrick's departure with an expression that was neither friendly nor overtly hostile, but rather assessing, as though calculating something of considerable importance. And Miss Merrick, walking away with Lady Bantry toward the tea tent, glanced back once over her shoulder, not at Mrs. Prothero, as one might expect, but at the handbag she'd been clutching throughout the conversation, checking its clasp with fingers that trembled slightly in the afternoon sun. Miss Marple purchased the tea cosy, which she did not need, and made her way toward the refreshment area, where she found Mrs. Carmichael sitting alone at one of the small tables, nursing a cup of tea and wearing the expression of someone who had witnessed something troubling but lacked the conviction to address it. "May I join you?" Miss Marple inquired, and Mrs. Carmichael gestured toward the empty chair with evident relief. "Please do. I confess I've been sitting here longer than I intended, simply because I couldn't quite face rejoining the general circulation." Mrs. Carmichael lowered her voice, though there was no one within immediate earshot. "Have you noticed how everyone is being so terribly careful around Lady Bantry? It's as though they're all walking on eggshells, trying not to mention the one thing that's on everyone's mind. The missing necklace naturally weighs heavily. Yes, but it's more than that. It's as though people have decided what happened and who was responsible, but no one wants to say it directly. Instead, there are all these pointed remarks and meaningful looks, and poor Lady Bantry is caught in the middle, trying to maintain normality while everyone around her is performing some sort of elaborate dance of implication." Miss Marple sipped her own tea, which was lukewarm and overly sweet, and considered Mrs. Carmichael's observation. "You've noticed something particular?" Mrs. Carmichael hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "I've noticed that Miss Merrick has been avoiding certain people. At the beginning of the afternoon when I arrived, I saw her turn away quite deliberately when she spotted Dr. Haydock coming through the gate. She pretended to be engrossed in the bookstall, but I'm certain she saw him. And just now, when young Lucy appeared at the edge of the lawn, she's helping with the washing up in the vicarage kitchen. Miss Merrick quite suddenly developed an urgent need to visit the ladies' cloakroom." "Interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "Isn't it? One would think if she believed Lucy guilty, she would want to observe her, perhaps watch for signs of nervousness or guilt. Instead, she seems almost fearful of encountering the girl directly." Mrs. Carmichael set down her cup with a decisive clink. "I know it's not my place to speculate, Miss Marple, and I'm certainly not one for gossip, but something about the entire situation strikes me as not quite right." Before Miss Marple could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Lady Bantry herself, looking somewhat harried, and carrying what appeared to be an excessive number of purchased items. "Jane, thank goodness. I've just endured the most exhausting conversation with Mrs. Henderson about the proper method for judging roses, which is apparently a subject of vital importance, requiring 20 minutes of detailed explanation." Lady Bantry deposited her acquisitions on the table and collapsed into a chair. "And Angela has disappeared somewhere. I do hope she hasn't gone home without telling me. She's been in the oddest mood all afternoon." "I noticed she seemed somewhat preoccupied," Miss Marple ventured. "Preoccupied is putting it mildly. She barely said 2 words during the drive here, and then at the bazaar she kept drifting away from conversations as though she couldn't bear to remain in one place for more than a few minutes." Lady Bantry's expression combined concern with a hint of exasperation. "I know she's sensitive, and I know the business with the necklace has upset her, but this seems excessive even for Angela." "Perhaps she feels responsible in some way," Mrs. Carmichael suggested gently. "But why should she? She had nothing to do with it. Unless—" Lady Bantry paused, a new thought evidently occurring to her. "Unless she knows something she hasn't told me. But what could she possibly know?" It was, Miss Marple reflected, the question at the heart of the entire matter. What did Angela Merrick know? And why was that knowledge making her behave with such peculiar discomfort? The young woman's avoidance of both Lucy and others who might ask questions, her constant checking of her handbag, her inability to meet eyes directly, all of it suggested someone carrying a burden of knowledge or guilt that was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. The afternoon continued its gentle course, and Miss Marple made her purchases and exchanged pleasantries with the requisite number of people, but her attention remained focused on observation. She watched Miss Merrick eventually reappear. Her earlier agitation somewhat subsided, but her eyes still restless, scanning the crowd as though looking for something or someone while simultaneously hoping not to find them. She observed Mrs. Protheroe in conversation with Mrs. Price Ridley, their heads close together in that way that indicated discussion of matters not meant for general consumption. And she noted Lucy, glimpsed briefly through the vicarage kitchen window, her face set in lines of miserable resignation, clearly aware that she'd become the subject of village speculation, and equally clearly uncertain how to defend herself against accusations that were never quite made directly. But most of all, Miss Marple noticed what was not said, what was carefully avoided, what glances did not linger on because to linger would be to acknowledge, and to acknowledge would be to confront truths that several people in St. Mary Mead seemed very determined to avoid. Guilt, Miss Marple had learned over many years of observation, rarely presented itself as dramatic confession or obvious nervous behaviour. More often, it manifested in small evasions, in conversations cut short, in eyes that skittered away from certain subjects or certain people. It looked, in fact, remarkably like care not to be noticed looking, like the desperate hope that if one appeared normal enough, no one would see the abnormality beneath. Walking home in the late afternoon, Miss Marple reflected that the pattern was becoming clearer, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly out of focus. But she was patient, as she had always been, confident that time and continued observation would eventually reveal what haste and direct confrontation could not. Chapter 6. A Story. Improved by repetition. Sunday morning service at St. Mary Mead provided, as it always did, an opportunity for the village to gather in a context that demanded decorum, while permitting a certain amount of discreet observation. Miss Marple arrived early, as was her habit, and settled into her usual pew near the middle of the church, where she could see most of the congregation without appearing to study them. Lady Bantry arrived with Miss Merrick just as the organ began its prelude, and Miss Marple noted the younger woman's pallor had deepened since yesterday's bazaar. She moved with the careful precision of someone who had not slept well, and when she knelt for prayer, her hands gripped the pew rail with unnecessary force. The service proceeded according to established ritual, the vicar delivering a sermon on the parable of the lost coin that several parishioners later agreed showed remarkable appropriateness to current circumstances, though whether this was intentional or coincidental remained a matter for speculation. Miss Marple listened with her customary attention, but her mind was occupied with observations that had little to do with scriptural interpretation. After the service, the congregation lingered in the churchyard as they invariably did on pleasant mornings, forming small clusters of conversation that shifted and reformed like patterns in a kaleidoscope. Miss Marple found herself drawn into a group that included Mrs. Price Ridley, Mrs. Protheroe, and Mrs. Carmichael, who were discussing the morning's sermon with the sort of enthusiasm that indicated they were actually discussing something else entirely. Such a thoughtful message, Mrs. Protheroe observed, all about how something precious can be lost through carelessness and found again through diligent searching. Really most apposite. Though sometimes, Mrs. Price Ridley added with meaningful emphasis, things are not lost through carelessness at all, but through deliberate action, in which case one must search not for the lost item, but for the person who took it. Miss Marple maintained her expression of polite interest while noting that Mrs. Protheroe's account of the sermon had become considerably more specific than the vicar's actual words. It was, she reflected, remarkable how people could hear in sermons exactly what they wished to hear, regardless of what had been said. I understand, Mrs. Price Ridley continued, lowering her voice to that particular register that ensured everyone nearby would strain to listen. that Lady Bantry has been making inquiries, quite thorough ones, I'm told, speaking to everyone who was present that afternoon, asking detailed questions about times and movements. This was news to Miss Marple, who had seen Lady Bantry only yesterday and heard nothing of any such inquiries. She filed the information away with appropriate scepticism. Yes, Mrs. Prothero confirmed. She spoke with me at length on Friday. Wanted to know precisely when I arrived, how long I stayed, whether I noticed anything unusual. She seemed particularly interested in when the tea things were cleared away. And what did you tell her? Mrs. Carmichael asked, her tone carefully neutral. Well, I could only tell her what I remembered naturally. I arrived at 3:30, as I recall, or was it 20 past? These things become rather blurred after a few days, but I'm certain I left around 6:15 just after the church clock struck. Or perhaps it was the half hour. In any case, I was there for the better part of 3 hours. Miss Marple's knitting needles, which she had brought along for the church fete planning meeting scheduled after service, continued their steady rhythm, but her mind was sharply focused. Mrs. Prothero's timeline had shifted considerably from what Miss Marple remembered. She herself had departed at 5:30, and Mrs. Prothero had left no more than 10 minutes after, having stayed only long enough to finish discussing the herbaceous borders. The conversation had not lasted 3 hours, nor anything close to it. I remember, Mrs. Price Ridley was saying, because I met you walking back past my house, and I commented on how the evening was drawing in. That must have been around 6 o'clock. Yes, exactly, Mrs. Prothero agreed, though Miss Marple noted a faint hesitation before the confirmation. One loses track of time in pleasant company, doesn't one? The conversation moved on to other topics, but Miss Marple remained thoughtful. It was not uncommon for people to misremember details after several days, but there was something purposeful about the way Mrs. Prothero had expanded her presence at Gossington, as though establishing a longer duration somehow validated her account or increased her importance as a witness. Monday afternoon brought another opportunity for observation. Miss Marple, visiting the lending library to return a biography she had found disappointingly superficial, encountered Miss Merrick examining the shelves with an air of desperate concentration that suggested she was not truly seeing the titles before her. "Miss Merrick," Miss Marple greeted her gently, "how nice to see you." The younger woman started visibly, nearly dropping the book she held. "Miss Marple? Yes, I was just... That is, Cousin Dolly asked me to fetch something light for her to read. She's been rather tired lately. The entire business must be weighing on her considerably." Yes, it has been difficult." Miss Merrick replaced the book she had been holding and selected another at random, not even glancing at its cover. "Everyone has been so kind, though. So many people offering to help, sharing their recollections of that afternoon. It's been quite overwhelming." "Recollections can be illuminating," Miss Marple observed, "though sometimes they require careful examination. Memory has a curious way of adjusting itself to accommodate what we think should have happened rather than what actually did." Miss Merrick's hand trembled slightly as she held the book. "I'm not sure I follow. I only mean that when several people recall the same event, their accounts often differ in small but significant ways. Take the matter of timing, for instance. I've heard 3 different versions now of when various people departed from Gossington last Tuesday." "Have you?" The question came out sharper than perhaps intended, and Miss Merrick immediately softened her tone. "I mean, yes, I suppose that's natural. No one was paying particular attention to the clock." "No, indeed, though I find it interesting how the accounts have evolved. Mrs. Prothero, for example, initially mentioned staying only briefly to admire the gardens. Now she recalls being present for nearly 3 hours. Miss Merrick's face had grown, if possible, even paler. "People remember differently, as you said. Perhaps she's simply trying to be helpful by being more precise." "Precision is valuable," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though there's a difference between precision and elaboration, rather like the difference between remembering an event and constructing a narrative." The younger woman made a show of consulting her watch. "I really must be getting back. Cousin Dolly will wonder what's become of me." She departed with rather more haste than seemed warranted, leaving Miss Marple to reflect on conversations that revealed more through what they avoided than what they said. Miss Merrick's discomfort with the subject of evolving recollections suggested she was aware of such evolution, and perhaps even concerned about where it might lead. That evening Miss Marple received an unexpected visit from Lady Bantry, who arrived just as the light was fading and accepted a glass of sherry, with the air of someone in need of fortification. "I've spent the past few days," Lady Bantry announced, "speaking to everyone who was present last Tuesday, trying to establish a clear timeline. And do you know what I've discovered, Jane? The more people tell me their version of events, the less clear anything becomes." "In what way?" "In every way. Mrs. Prothero now insists she was there for hours longer than I remember. Mrs. Carmichael has suddenly recalled seeing Lucy near the side table, though she mentioned no such thing initially. Even Angela has begun adding details to her account that I'm certain weren't there when we first discussed it." Lady Bantry took a fortifying sip of sherry. "It's as though everyone has been rehearsing their story, polishing it, making it more complete and more consistent, until what they're telling me bears only a passing resemblance to what actually occurred." "And what do you think this means?" Lady Bantry set down her glass with careful precision. "I think it means that someone is trying very hard to create a particular narrative, one that points firmly in a specific direction, and I'm beginning to suspect that the person doing the pointing is not necessarily the person who took the necklace, but rather someone who wishes to ensure that suspicion falls elsewhere." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You're thinking of Miss Merrick." "I'm ashamed to say I am. She's been so insistent on Lucy's guilt, so eager to provide details about the girl's supposedly questionable character. And now I discover she's been having quiet conversations with both Mrs. Prothero and Mrs. Price Ridley, during which, I can only assume, certain suggestions have been made, certain interpretations encouraged. The question becomes," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "why someone would work so hard to direct suspicion toward an innocent party unless they had a compelling reason to ensure attention remained focused away from themselves." "Yes," Lady Bantry agreed quietly. "That is precisely the question I've been trying not to ask myself. But I can no longer avoid it, can I?" They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken conclusions settling between them. Outside, the evening deepened into night, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected, someone was sleeping poorly, knowing that stories, no matter how carefully constructed and diligently rehearsed, eventually encounter the uncomfortable reality of truth. Chapter 7. What Miss Marple noted while others spoke. Tuesday morning found Miss Marple in her garden once again, though her hands moved through the familiar motions of deadheading roses, while her mind worked through a different kind of cultivation entirely. She had spent the night reviewing her observations, arranging and rearranging them like pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal its complete picture until viewed from precisely the correct angle. The difficulty with mysteries, she reflected, was that people insisted on believing them to be complicated when they were usually remarkably simple. What appeared as elaborate deception was often nothing more than fear making itself elaborate, guilt constructing defences, or need justifying itself through layer upon layer of rationalisation. She was contemplating this when Mrs. Carmichael appeared at the garden gate, looking hesitant in a way that suggested she had been debating whether to call at all. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Mrs. Carmichael began, and Miss Marple, recognising the signs of someone who had come to share information they felt duty-bound to reveal, but were uncomfortable revealing, assured her she was quite welcome. They settled in the small arbour where Miss Marple took her morning tea in fine weather, and Mrs. Carmichael spent several moments arranging her gloves and handbag with the excessive care of someone marshalling courage. "I've been thinking about that afternoon at Gossington," she said finally, trying to remember it exactly as it happened, rather than as I've heard it described since, and I've realised something that troubled me at the time, but which I dismissed as unimportant. "Yes?" Miss Marple encouraged gently. "It was when Lady Bantry showed us the necklace. We all admired it naturally, and it was passed around for closer examination. I remember thinking how beautiful it was, but also how the emeralds caught the light in the most extraordinary way, almost as though they were alive." Mrs. Carmichael paused, her brow furrowed in concentration. But what I'm trying to recall is the order in which we handled it. Lady Bantry held it first, then passed it to Mrs. Prothero, who examined it rather thoroughly before passing it to me. I looked at it only briefly. I'm always nervous handling valuable things, and then passed it to Miss Merrick. And Miss Merrick, that's what troubles me. She held it for rather a long time, longer than seemed quite natural, and she didn't simply look at it, she studied it. Her fingers traced over the setting, examined the clasp, felt the weight of it in her hands. At the time I thought she was merely admiring the craftsmanship, but now I wonder if she was noting something else entirely. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as she considered this, and after Miss Merrick examined it, she returned it to Lady Bantry, who placed it back in the velvet case and closed it. That I remember quite clearly, because Lady Bantry made a small joke about how the necklace spent too much time in its case, and not enough time being worn. And Miss Merrick said, I remember this because it struck me as an odd phrasing, she said, perhaps it's safer that way. Safer, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Yes, not more protected or better preserved, but safer, as though the necklace itself was somehow vulnerable to harm rather than simply being a valuable object requiring security. Mrs. Carmichael smoothed her gloves across her lap. It may mean nothing at all, of course. I'm not accustomed to this sort of analysis. On the contrary, you've provided something quite valuable. Sometimes the exact words people choose reveal more than entire paragraphs of explanation. After Mrs. Carmichael departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in the arbour, letting the pieces arrange themselves. She thought about Angela Merrick's pale face at the tea party, her careful examination of the necklace, her comment about safety. She thought about the young woman's subsequent behaviour, her avoidance of Lucy, her eagerness to direct suspicion elsewhere, her nervous checking of her handbag at the bazaar. And she thought about something else, something she had observed but not consciously registered at the time. The way Miss Merrick had looked at Lady Bantry when the necklace was first produced. Not with envy or greed, but with something closer to alarm, followed immediately by resignation, as though she were watching something inevitable unfold and was powerless to prevent it. The pattern was becoming clearer now, though the complete explanation still required one more element. Miss Marple rose from her chair with decision and made her way into the house, where she placed a telephone call to Gossington Hall. "Dolly," she said when Lady Bantry answered, "I wonder if you might spare me a few moments this afternoon. There's something I'd like to discuss with you, but I'd prefer to do so in person." An hour later, Miss Marple was once again seated in the morning room at Gossington Hall, this time with Lady Bantry giving her complete and undivided attention. "I've been thinking about motive," Miss Marple began without preamble. "Not the motive one might expect, simple theft for financial gain, but rather something more complex and in its way more understandable." Lady Bantry leaned forward. "Go on." "You mentioned last Tuesday that you intended to wear the necklace to the Latimers' dinner next month. But I wonder, was that your only plan for it? Had you perhaps mentioned any other intentions to Miss Merrick?" Lady Bantry's expression shifted from attention to something closer to comprehension. "Yes," she said slowly. "Yes, I had. In fact, I'd discussed it with her only the week before. I'd been thinking that the necklace ought perhaps to be sold. It's been sitting unused for years, and the proceeds could fund the new children's wing at the hospital. Angela and I had quite a long conversation about it." "And how did Miss Merrick respond to this proposal?" She was rather upset, actually. More upset than I'd expected. She kept saying that the necklace was a family heirloom, that my husband's grandmother had meant it to be passed down, that it would be wrong to sell it for any reason, however charitable. Lady Bantry's fingers pleated the fabric of her skirt. I tried to explain that family treasures are meaningless if they serve no purpose, but she was quite adamant. We left the conversation unresolved. And then, last Tuesday, you announced your intention to wear it to a dinner party, which must have suggested to Angela that I'd decided against selling it. Lady Bantry's eyes widened with sudden understanding. She would have thought the necklace was safe, that I'd changed my mind. And then when I said I intended to wear it, she must have worried I was simply preparing to show it off one final time before disposing of it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Exactly. And if one believed that a treasured family heirloom was about to be sold, and if one felt strongly that such a sale would be a betrayal of family trust, one might be tempted to preserve it. By taking it herself. Lady Bantry's voice was barely above a whisper. Not to steal it for her own benefit, but to prevent me from selling it. To keep it safe, as she said, until I came to my senses. It would explain several things that have puzzled me, Miss Marple continued. Her intimate knowledge of the necklace's appearance, suggesting she'd examined it carefully before. Her immediate distress when it went missing. Not the distress of someone guilty of theft, but the distress of someone whose protective action had gone terribly wrong. Her eagerness to direct suspicion toward Lucy, not from malice, but from desperate need to prevent investigation that might expose her own involvement. And her constant anxiety, her inability to meet people's eyes, her checking of her handbag. Lady Bantry closed her eyes briefly. She's been carrying it with her, hasn't she? Afraid to keep it in her room where it might be found during a search, but equally afraid to be parted from it. That would be my supposition, yes. Lady Bantry rose and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens where everything appeared peaceful and ordered. The terrible thing is, Jane, I can almost understand it. She's always been so attached to family history, to the idea of continuity and tradition. Her own family lost nearly everything in bad investments before the war, and I think she's transferred all her feelings about preservation and proper stewardship onto my family's possessions. Understanding motive doesn't excuse action, Miss Marple said gently, but it does make it more comprehensible. She didn't take the necklace out of greed or spite, but out of misguided protectiveness. She believed she was preventing a greater wrong. What should I do? Lady Bantry turned back from the window, her face showing the strain of the past week. She's family, Jane. She's been staying in my home, sharing my table. How do I confront her with this without destroying what remains of our relationship? Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Perhaps, she said carefully, the confrontation need not be confrontational. Perhaps what's required is simply an opportunity for truth to emerge naturally without accusation or judgment. Sometimes people need only to understand that confession will be met with compassion rather than condemnation. You mean I should let her know, somehow, that I understand? That I'm not angry, merely concerned for her welfare? I mean that guilt carried alone becomes unbearable, but guilt acknowledged and forgiven becomes bearable. Miss Merrick has been living with the weight of her action for over a week now, watching Lucy suffer unjust suspicion, seeing the household disrupted, knowing herself to be the cause. That's punishment enough for someone with a conscience, which I believe Miss Merrick possesses in abundance. Lady Bantry returned to her chair, settling into it with the air of someone who had made a difficult decision. Very well, I shall speak with her this evening privately. Not as an interrogation, but as a conversation between family members who care for each other despite errors of judgment. That seems wisest, Miss Marple agreed, and perhaps, afterward, some consideration might be given to why she felt such protective action was necessary. Family treasures serve their purpose best when they strengthen bonds rather than creating anxiety about their preservation. They talked for a while longer, discussing how best to approach the delicate conversation, how to ensure Lucy's name was cleared without humiliating Miss Merrick, how to restore peace to a household that had been unsettled by secrets and suspicion. When Miss Marple finally departed, walking back through the village in the warm afternoon sun, she reflected that human nature remained remarkably consistent across all classes and circumstances. The impulse to protect what one loved, even through questionable means, was as old as humanity itself. The tragedy was not that people felt such impulses, but that they so often felt compelled to act on them alone, without trusting others to understand their concerns or share their burdens. Chapter 8. The Value of Being Considered Harmless. That evening Miss Marple sat in her parlour with her knitting, though her hands moved with less attention than usual, and she had to unpick the same row twice before accepting that her mind was not on woolen garments. she found herself thinking about the curious advantage of being underestimated, of how invisibility could be a form of power when properly understood. Throughout the entire affair of Lady Bantry's necklace, Miss Marple had observed from a position that most people would consider negligible. She was elderly, unmarried, occupied with gardens and knitting and church committees. In short, precisely the sort of person whom the world had long ago decided could be safely ignored in matters of consequence. This was, she had discovered over many years, an extraordinarily useful position to occupy. People spoke freely in front of her, assuming she either wasn't listening or wouldn't understand the implications of what was said. They performed their small deceptions and rehearsed their careful lies while she sat with her knitting, seemingly absorbed in counting stitches, actually counting inconsistencies. They dismissed her gentle questions as the wandering curiosity of an old woman with too much time and too little to occupy it, never recognizing that behind those mild inquiries lay decades of careful observation of human behaviour. She thought about how Angela Merrick had relaxed somewhat in her presence at the library, assuming that Miss Marple's comments about evolving recollections were merely abstract philosophical observations rather than pointed remarks about specific behaviour. She thought about how Mrs. Prothero had freely elaborated her timeline in Miss Marple's hearing, confident that an elderly village spinster would neither notice the inconsistencies nor understand their significance. And she thought about Lucy, who had looked at her with the desperate hope of someone seeking an ally in a household where everyone else seemed to have already reached conclusions about her character. The girl had recognized, perhaps instinctively, that Miss Marple was paying a different kind of attention than the others, seeing beyond surfaces to the patterns beneath. The following morning brought a note from Lady Bantry, delivered by hand and written in a script that showed signs of having been composed with considerable emotion held carefully in check. "Jane," it read, "you were quite right in all particulars. Angela and I spoke last evening for nearly 2 hours. She has returned the necklace and expressed profound remorse for the distress her actions caused. I am writing to you now because I believe you deserve to know the complete story, and because your insight made this resolution possible. Might you call this afternoon? There are details I wish to share with you in person. Yours in gratitude, Dolly." Miss Marple arrived at Gossington Hall at 3 o'clock to find Lady Bantry in the morning room, looking considerably more relaxed than she had in days, though there remained about her eyes the particular softness that comes from recent tears shed in relief rather than sorrow. "Thank you for coming," Lady Bantry said, gesturing Miss Marple to her usual chair. "I wanted you to hear the full account, partly because you deserve to understand how accurate your reasoning was, and partly because I value your opinion on how to proceed from here." She poured tea with steady hands and settled herself before continuing. "Angela came to me last evening just after dinner. She'd received a note from me suggesting we might have a private conversation, and I think she knew immediately what it concerned. She looked at Jane like someone who had been waiting for an axe to fall, and was almost relieved when it finally did. Guilt carried too long becomes its own punishment," Miss Marple observed. "Exactly what I thought. She sat exactly where you're sitting now and simply said, 'I took it, Cousin Dolly, the necklace. I'm so desperately sorry.' And then she wept, not dramatically, but with such genuine anguish that I found myself comforting her rather than demanding explanations." Lady Bantry took a sip of tea, gathering her thoughts. "The story, when it emerged, was much as you surmised. She'd been horrified when I mentioned selling the necklace, and she spent that entire week trying to convince herself that I wouldn't really do it, that I was merely considering the idea abstractly. But when I brought it out at tea and announced my intention to wear it to the Latimers, she panicked. She thought you were preparing to show it off before disposing of it." "Precisely. She said she had this overwhelming sense that she was watching a piece of family history about to be carelessly discarded, and that she had to prevent it somehow. So when we all moved to the conservatory and the drawing room was briefly empty, she doubled back, opened the case, took the necklace, and concealed it in her handbag." Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised, and then found herself trapped by her own action. Completely trapped. She'd acted on impulse, without thinking through the consequences, and once the theft was discovered, she couldn't admit what she'd done without appearing to be a common thief. She was caught between the truth, which would humiliate her, and silence, which made her complicit in allowing suspicion to fall on Lucy. Hence her attempts to direct investigation elsewhere, not to protect herself so much as to prevent deeper inquiry that might expose her. Yes, though she swears she never actually accused Lucy directly. She merely, as she put it, allowed others to draw their own conclusions and perhaps encourage those conclusions through careful omissions rather than outright lies. Lady Bantry's expression showed both understanding and disapproval. It's a fine distinction, though I'm not sure it's a meaningful one. And the necklace itself, hidden in her handbag the entire time, wrapped in a handkerchief and kept with her constantly. She said she barely slept, terrified someone would search her room, or that she'd somehow give herself away. Every conversation felt like a potential trap, every question an interrogation. She was, she said, living in a state of perpetual fear. Miss Marple considered this, recognizing the particular torture of guilt that cannot be confessed, and anxiety that cannot be relieved. What made her finally decide to confess? She said it was Sunday's sermon, oddly enough. The parable of the lost coin struck her with unexpected force. She kept thinking about how the woman in the parable searched diligently until the coin was found, and she realized she was preventing exactly that kind of honest searching by maintaining her deception. Also, Lady Bantry added with a slight smile, she mentioned that you had spoken to her in the library about how memory adjusts itself to accommodate what we think should have happened rather than what did. She said your tone suggested you knew more than you were saying, and that she understood she was no longer fooling anyone. The value of gentle observation, Miss Marple murmured. Indeed. She said she felt as though you could see right through her, that your questions, however politely phrased, went straight to the heart of what she was trying to hide. It unnerved her considerably. Lady Bantry refilled their cups. I asked her why she thought I would be angry rather than understanding if she had simply explained her concerns about the necklace in the first place. And what did she say? She said she was ashamed to admit how much family possessions meant to her, given that her own family had lost everything. She felt it made her seem grasping or mercenary to care so deeply about objects that weren't even technically hers. So she'd kept her feelings to herself and let them fester until they drove her to this foolish action. Miss Marple reflected on this, recognizing a familiar pattern. How often, she thought, did people create elaborate deceptions to hide feelings they assumed would be judged harshly, when honesty from the beginning would have prevented all subsequent complications? Angela Merrick had been afraid of appearing possessive, and in trying to hide that fear, she had become exactly what she feared being perceived as, someone who valued objects over relationships. What will you do now? She asked. I've assured Angela that she remains welcome here as long as she wishes to stay, though I suspect she may prefer to return to London once she's recovered her composure. I've also told her that I've decided not to sell the necklace after all, at least not immediately. I can contribute to the hospital fund through other means. Lady Bantry smiled slightly. I'm not sure whether that decision is wisdom or weakness, but it seems the right thing to do. Sometimes wisdom and kindness are indistinguishable. Perhaps I've also spoken to Lucy and explained that she was never under genuine suspicion from me, though I fear the village gossip has wounded her. I've given her a small bonus and a letter of reference that praises her character effusively, which she can use should she decide to seek employment elsewhere. I hope she'll stay, but I would understand if she chose not to. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the afternoon sun slanting through the windows and illuminating dust motes that drifted in the warm air. Miss Marple thought about all the small observations that had accumulated over the past week, each one insignificant in itself, but collectively forming a clear picture of what had truly occurred. You know, Lady Bantry said thoughtfully, what strikes me most about this entire affair is how unnecessary it all was. If Angela had simply trusted me enough to express her feelings honestly, we could have discussed them rationally. If the village had been less eager to speculate and more inclined to wait for facts, Lucy would have been spared considerable distress. If we had all been a bit less concerned with maintaining appearances and a bit more concerned with understanding each other, the whole thing could have been resolved in a day rather than dragging on for a week. That's often the case with mysteries, Miss Marple observed. They persist not because the truth is particularly well hidden, but because people are more comfortable with speculation than with honesty. They prefer the drama of uncertainty to the sometimes uncomfortable clarity of actual knowledge. And where do you fit into all that, Jane? You seem to understand what was happening almost from the beginning. Miss Marple smiled gently. I have the advantage of being considered harmless. People forget I'm listening, or they assume I'm too naive to understand what I'm hearing. It allows me to observe without being observed, to note patterns that others miss because they're too busy performing for each other. You're far more formidable than you appear. That, Miss Marple replied with quiet satisfaction, is rather the point. There's considerable value in being underestimated, just as there's considerable danger in overestimating one's ability to deceive. Angela learned that lesson the hard way, I think. She believed she could hide her guilt behind elaborate misdirection, not realizing that guilt announces itself most clearly through the very efforts made to conceal it. Lady Bantry nodded, understanding. And now? Now, Miss Marple said, gathering her things to depart. The necklace is returned. Lucy is vindicated. Angela has learned something important about the cost of deception, and the village will find something new to occupy its attention. Life will return to its normal rhythms, which is as it should be. Walking home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple reflected that being considered harmless had indeed proved valuable once again. It had allowed her to see clearly what others, blinded by their own assumptions and preoccupations, had missed entirely, and that, she thought with quiet contentment, was worth far more than any amount of dramatic recognition or public praise. Chapter 9. How the Necklace Truly Travelled. The following afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. Angela Merrick stood at the garden gate with the uncertain posture of someone who had debated whether to come at all, and was still not entirely convinced of the wisdom of the decision. Miss Marple, she began, her voice carrying the particular hoarseness that follows prolonged emotion, I hope you don't mind my calling. Lady Bantry said you were instrumental in helping her understand what happened. I felt I owed you an explanation, or perhaps an apology, or... She trailed off, clearly unsure of exactly what she owed or why she had come. Miss Marple opened the gate and gestured toward the small table in the garden where she'd been enjoying the afternoon sun. You're very welcome, Miss Merrick. Please sit down. I was just about to have some tea. They settled themselves, and Miss Marple attended to the business of pouring and offering biscuits with a calm efficiency that gave nervous visitors time to compose themselves. Miss Merrick accepted her cup with hands that trembled only slightly, an improvement over the visible anxiety she had displayed throughout the past week. I wanted you to know, Miss Merrick said after a long sip of tea, that I'm not naturally dishonest. I've never taken anything that didn't belong to me, never told lies for personal gain. What happened with the necklace was something I never imagined myself capable of doing. Few people imagine themselves capable of their worst actions until circumstances provide sufficient motivation, Miss Marple observed gently. Miss Merrick nodded, her eyes fixed on her teacup. When Cousin Dolly first mentioned selling the necklace, my immediate thought was that it was wrong. Not just unwise or unfortunate, but actually morally wrong. Those emeralds have been in the family for 3 generations. They were given as a wedding gift, worn by women who built lives and raised families, passed down with the understanding that they would continue to be passed down. To sell them for any reason, however charitable, seemed like a betrayal of all that history. You felt yourself to be a guardian of family tradition. Yes, exactly. My own family lost everything. Houses, land, furniture, even my grandmother's jewellery, all sold piece by piece to cover debts and poor investments. I grew up hearing stories about beautiful things that had once belonged to us, things my mother would never see again. When I came to stay with Cousin Dolly and saw how casually she treated her possessions, how little she seemed to value their historical significance, it troubled me deeply. Miss Marple listened with the attention that encouraged further revelation, her knitting needles moving in their steady rhythm. I tried to argue with her about it, Miss Merrick continued, but she wouldn't hear me. She said objects were meant to be useful, that keeping things locked away was pointless when they could serve a better purpose. She didn't understand that some things are valuable precisely because they connect us to the past, because they represent continuity in a world where everything else changes. So when she brought out the necklace that afternoon at tea, you felt time was running out. Miss Merrick's expression showed remembered panic. I thought she was displaying it one last time before the sale, showing it off to her friends, letting everyone admire it before it disappeared into some stranger's jewellery box, or worse, was broken up and the emeralds reset into modern pieces. The thought was unbearable. And so you took it. Not immediately. I sat through the rest of the tea trying to convince myself to do nothing, that it wasn't my place to intervene. But when we moved to the conservatory and I saw the case sitting there on the side table, unattended and vulnerable, I couldn't stop myself. I told Cousin Dolly I needed to fetch a shawl and doubled back to the drawing room. Miss Marple could picture the scene clearly. The young woman moving quickly through the empty drawing room, opening the velvet case with hands made clumsy by nervousness and haste, removing the necklace and concealing it in her handbag, closing the case again and replacing it exactly where it had been. All of it accomplished in perhaps 2 minutes, driven by the conviction that she was preventing a greater wrong. "What did you intend to do with it?" Miss Merrick's laugh was bitter. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I suppose I imagined keeping it hidden until Cousin Dolly came to her senses, then somehow replacing it with some explanation about having found it. Or perhaps I thought I would eventually confess, but that she would understand and forgive me, because I'd been protecting something precious. I don't know. I wasn't thinking clearly. And then it was discovered missing. Yes, and suddenly what had seemed like protective action became theft. I realised I'd put myself in an impossible position. If I returned it immediately, I'd have to explain why I'd taken it in the first place, which would reveal depths of presumption and interference that would destroy my relationship with Cousin Dolly. If I continued to hide it, I became complicit in all the distress and suspicion that followed. She set down her teacup with careful precision. The worst part was watching Lucy suffer. I never intended for suspicion to fall on her. I thought people would assume the necklace had simply been mislaid, that it would turn up eventually without anyone being blamed. But Mrs. Prothero and Mrs. Price Ridley began their speculation, and once they fixed on Lucy as the obvious suspect, I didn't know how to deflect their attention without drawing it to myself, so you encouraged it instead. Miss Merrick flushed. Not directly. I never accused Lucy of anything, but I didn't defend her either, and I may have mentioned small observations that allowed others to reach their own conclusions. It was cowardly and wrong, and I shall have to live with the knowledge of what I did to that poor girl. Lady Bantry has spoken with Lucy. Yes, and given her a generous bonus and an excellent reference. But money and words don't undo the damage of being suspected by an entire village. Lucy knows now that she was innocent, but she also knows that everyone was prepared to believe her guilty based on nothing more than her newness and her class. That's a bitter lesson to learn at 19. They sat in silence for a moment, the garden around them peaceful in the afternoon warmth. A bee investigated the roses with methodical thoroughness, and somewhere in a nearby tree a bird sang with unself-conscious enthusiasm. "May I ask," Miss Merrick said finally, "how you knew? Cousin Dolly said you'd understood almost from the beginning." Miss Marple smiled slightly. It was largely a matter of observation and elimination. The necklace disappeared from a closed case in a room that was briefly unattended but visible. This suggested someone who had legitimate reason to be in that room and whose presence would not be questioned. Lucy was too nervous and too new to have risked such an action. Mrs. Prothero and Mrs. Carmichael had no apparent motive. That left you. But what gave me away specifically? Several things, none decisive in itself but collectively quite revealing. Your examination of the necklace when it was passed around suggested more than casual admiration. You were studying it, memorizing it. Your comment about it being safer in its case carried implications you perhaps didn't intend. Your subsequent behaviour showed not the guilt of a common thief, but the anxiety of someone who had acted from protective impulses and found themselves trapped by the consequences. Miss Marple paused, choosing her next words carefully. And there was your handbag, which you kept close at all times and checked repeatedly, as though reassuring yourself that something precious was still safely concealed. That suggested you were carrying something you couldn't risk being separated from, something that required constant vigilance. Miss Merrick nodded slowly. I thought I was being subtle. I thought no one could possibly know what I'd done unless I told them. But you saw through all of it. Not immediately, Miss Marple admitted. It took time to assemble the observations into a coherent picture, and I had the advantage of being someone people ignore, which allowed me to watch without being watched in return. Cousin Dolly says you're far more perceptive than you appear. I prefer to think of it as simply paying attention. Most people are so occupied with their own concerns that they miss what's happening around them. I have the luxury of time and the habit of observation, which together provide considerable insight into human behaviour. Miss Merrick finished her tea and set the cup aside. I came to thank you, though I'm not sure thanks are appropriate given that you exposed my wrongdoing. But Cousin Dolly says that without your insight, she might have continued suspecting Lucy, or even called in the police, which would have made everything much worse. So thank you, I suppose, for seeing the truth even when it was unflattering. The truth is rarely flattering, Miss Marple observed, but it's generally preferable to comfortable deception. You've learned that now, I think. I have, though the learning was rather more painful than I would have wished. After Miss Merrick departed, walking back toward Gossington with the lighter step of someone who had confessed and been, if not absolved, at least understood, Miss Marple reflected on the curious paths by which objects travelled, and the even more curious paths by which truth emerged. The necklace had moved not through stealth or criminal cunning, but through the simple assumption that one person's judgment about what was right superseded another person's authority over their own possessions. It had travelled in a handbag through a village, hidden in plain sight, protected by the very person who should have been protecting its owner's rights instead. And the truth had travelled through observation, through the accumulation of small inconsistencies, through the patient work of watching and noting and understanding what people revealed about themselves through actions they believed were invisible. It was, Miss Marple thought, a rather typical example of how most mysteries unfolded, not through dramatic revelations or shocking discoveries, but through the steady application of attention to detail and the willingness to look beyond surfaces to the human motivations that lay beneath. Chapter 10. When Possession Returned, Quietly Home. A fortnight passed before Miss Marple had occasion to visit Gossington Hall again, and when she did, it was at Lady Bantry's invitation to take luncheon and enjoy the gardens, which were reaching their midsummer glory. The intervening weeks had allowed the village to absorb the resolution of the necklace affair and move on to fresher topics of speculation, as villages always did once a mystery had been satisfactorily explained or sufficiently forgotten. Miss Marple found Lady Bantry in excellent spirits, presiding over a cold luncheon laid out on the terrace, with a sort of relaxed hospitality that suggested domestic peace had been restored. The emerald necklace, she mentioned casually while serving the salmon, had been returned to the safe where it would remain for the foreseeable future, though she had not entirely abandoned the idea of eventually selling it for charitable purposes. Not immediately, though, Lady Bantry added, passing the mayonnaise. I've learned that timing matters, and that one must be sensitive to the feelings of others even when those feelings seem excessive. Angela has returned to London, by the way. She felt it best to remove herself from the scene of her embarrassment, though I've assured her she's welcome here whenever she wishes to visit. How did she seem when she departed? Subdued, but not defeated. I think the experience taught her something valuable about the difference between caring for things and being controlled by them. She wrote me a lovely letter last week, apologising again and reflecting on how family possessions had become, in her mind, a substitute for the family connection she'd lost. Rather insightful, I thought. for someone so young. Miss Marple agreed that self-awareness was a gift not everyone possessed, and that Miss Merrick's willingness to examine her own motivations spoke well of her character despite her error in judgment. "And Lucy?" Miss Marple inquired. "How has she fared?" Lady Bantry's expression brightened considerably. "Remarkably well, actually. I was afraid she might wish to leave, given how unpleasant the experience must have been. But she's chosen to stay. She told Maitland she appreciated that I'd defended her even before the truth came out, and that loyalty deserved loyalty in return. I've given her additional responsibilities, and she's risen to them beautifully. I think she'll make an excellent household manager someday if she chooses to continue in service." They ate in companionable silence for a few moments, enjoying the warmth of the day and the pleasure of good food in pleasant surroundings. Miss Marple reflected that one of the underappreciated advantages of age was the ability to be comfortable with silence, to let conversations unfold naturally, rather than forcing them into constant chatter. "You know," Lady Bantry said eventually, setting down her fork, "I've been thinking about what you said regarding how people prefer speculation to honesty. It's quite true. I noticed it myself during those awful days when everyone was so busy theorizing and gossiping. They seemed almost disappointed when the truth proved less dramatic than their imaginings." "People invest considerable energy in their theories," Miss Marple observed. "To discover those theories were incorrect feels rather like wasted effort, so they resist accepting simple explanations, even when those explanations fit all the available facts. Mrs. Prothero, for instance, still maintains that there was something suspicious about Lucy's behaviour, even though we know now she was entirely innocent. She can't quite bring herself to admit she was wrong, so she shifted to suggesting that Lucy might have been guilty of other small misdemeanours, even if not this particular theft." Miss Marple smiled slightly. "Mrs. Prothero is perhaps more attached to the pleasure of suspicion than to the satisfaction of truth. Some people are simply more comfortable with uncertainty than with resolution. And Mrs. Price Ridley has been telling everyone that she suspected Angela all along, which is demonstrably false given how enthusiastically she participated in the speculation about Lucy. But memories adjust themselves to preserve self-regard, don't they?" "They do indeed. It's one of the more reliable features of human nature." After luncheon, they walked through the gardens, admiring the roses and discussing plans for autumn planting. The conversation was deliberately light, moving through safe topics with the ease of two people who had shared something significant and no longer needed to discuss it directly. They had reached an understanding that transcended the particular circumstances of the necklace, an understanding about how villages worked and how people behaved when placed under the stress of suspicion and uncertainty. As they completed their circuit of the garden and returned to the terrace, Lady Bantry paused by a bench overlooking the lawn. "I wanted to ask your advice about something, Jane. Not about mysteries or stolen jewellery, but about the necklace itself and what it represents." Miss Marple settled herself on the bench, prepared to listen. Angela was wrong to take it, obviously, but she wasn't entirely wrong about everything. The necklace does have considerable sentimental value, and perhaps I was too cavalier in considering its sale. Not because objects are more important than people or charitable causes, but because sometimes objects serve as tangible connections to those we've lost. My husband's grandmother wore those emeralds at her wedding and at every significant family event thereafter. To sell them would be to sever that connection, however much good the money might do. Yet you mentioned you haven't entirely abandoned the idea of selling. No, because Angela was also wrong to place the preservation of objects above the well-being of people. The hospital needs funding, and I have the means to provide it. The question is whether I can find a way to honour both concerns, the past represented by the necklace and the future represented by the children's wing. Miss Marple considered this thoughtfully. Perhaps the answer lies in understanding that preservation can take many forms. A necklace locked in a safe preserves nothing but the emeralds themselves. A necklace worn and seen and admired preserves the memory of those who wore it before. And a necklace sold for purposes that would have pleased its original owners preserves their values rather than merely their possessions. Lady Bantry nodded slowly. you're suggesting that selling it needn't be a betrayal if it's done in the right spirit and for the right reasons. I'm suggesting that objects serve us, not the other way around. If keeping the necklace brings you genuine joy and maintains meaningful connections to your family's past, then by all means keep it. But if it sits in a safe gathering darkness and meaning nothing to anyone, then perhaps it deserves a better fate than mere preservation. And if I do decide to sell it eventually, I should do so openly and with proper ceremony, acknowledging what it represents while explaining why its sale serves a higher purpose. Exactly. Angela's mistake was not in caring about the necklace's history, but in believing that history could only be honoured through physical retention. History lives in stories and values and the choices we make, not in objects we hoard. They sat together for a while longer, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across the lawn. A blackbird sang from somewhere in the shrubbery, and the scent of roses drifted on the warm air. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of peaceful moment that made village life worthwhile, when problems had been solved and tensions eased, and the ordinary rhythms of existence could resume their comforting patterns. When Miss Marple finally took her leave, walking back through the village in the golden late afternoon light, she found herself thinking about how mysteries ended, not with dramatic confrontations or shocking revelations, but with quiet conversations and gradual understanding, with people finding their way back to equilibrium after being temporarily displaced by events beyond their control. The necklace had returned to its case and would remain there, a source of neither anxiety nor obsession, simply a beautiful object that happened to carry with it certain associations and memories. Lucy had returned to her duties with renewed confidence and increased responsibility. Angela had returned to London with painful wisdom earned through experience, and the village had returned to its customary preoccupations, the affair of the missing necklace already becoming the sort of story people would relate in years to come, with appropriate embellishments and strategic omissions. Miss Marple herself had returned to her garden and her knitting, and her quiet observation of human nature in all its fascinating complexity. She had learned nothing particularly new from this episode. Human behaviour remained as predictable as ever, with fear driving deception and pride preventing confession, until circumstances made confession unavoidable. But she had been reminded of something valuable, that understanding, when offered with compassion rather than judgment, could transform what might have been a tragedy into merely an unfortunate episode from which useful lessons could be extracted. The smallest thefts, she reflected as she reached her cottage gate, were indeed those committed in the name of care. Angela Merrick had taken the necklace not from greed or malice, but from misguided protectiveness, believing herself to be preserving something precious when in fact she was only demonstrating how possession, taken too seriously, could poison the very relationships it was meant to honour. But possession had returned quietly home now, both the necklace to its case and the various participants to their proper places in village life. The equilibrium had been restored, the lessons had been learned, and St Mary Mead could continue its placid existence secure in the knowledge